The sound of steel biting into flesh is not a sound one forgets. It is wet, deliberate, and final. The crowd held its breath as the executioner drew the knife across the pale skin of the condemned. The man's body jerked against his restraints, a strangled cry escaping his lips. Blood poured in thin, wavering streams, staining the packed earth beneath his feet. But this was only the first cut. There would be hundreds more. He would not die swiftly, nor even within the hour. His torment would stretch into days, 7 in total, each sunrise bringing with it another ritual of pain, another step in the slow dismantling of his body. This was no ordinary punishment. No common criminal or petty traitor stood bound before the knives. This was the Son of Heaven himself, the Emperor of Southern Qi, ruler of millions, chosen by Heaven's mandate to sit upon the dragon throne. His name was Xiao Baowen, and in the year 501 CE, he became the victim of one of the most gruesome executions in recorded history. Lingchi, the death by 1,000 cuts. To witness an emperor reduced to such a fate was to see the cosmic order itself inverted. The emperor was meant to embody the will of heaven, to be the link between earth and the divine. Yet here he was, carved apart like a sacrificial animal, his cries mingling with the jeers of his subjects. To understand how such a horror could unfold, we must step into the brutal, fractured world of medieval China at the turn of the 6th century, an age where loyalty was fleeting, dynasties rose and fell in decades, and power was maintained through terror as much as through governance. The Southern Qi dynasty was one of many short-lived kingdoms in the Southern and Northern dynasties period, an era marked by instability, shifting alliances, and near-constant war. The dynasty had been born out of bloodshed, and it would end in bloodshed. By the time Xiao Baowen came to the throne in 498 CE, the empire was already fragile, riddled with conspiracies and torn by rival factions vying for influence over a boy king. He was only 15 years old when he inherited the throne, an age at which most boys were barely considered men, let alone rulers of empires. Yet the mantle of emperor does not wait for maturity. Surrounded by ambitious generals, whispering courtiers, and scheming relatives, Xiao Baowen quickly learned the one lesson every insecure ruler clings to: fear is power. He wielded cruelty like a sword, cutting down officials at the faintest hint of disloyalty. Ministers were executed without trial, generals disgraced, family members slaughtered. The imperial court became a place of dread. Attendants bowed low, afraid to speak, their voices trembling lest they say the wrong word and be dragged to the execution grounds. But fear is a fragile foundation for power. While terror can silence dissent for a time, it also breeds hatred, resentment, and the slow erosion of loyalty. In his short reign, Xiao Baowen created more enemies than allies. His cruelty, his paranoia, and his indulgence in luxury while the empire struggled sowed the seeds of his downfall. And so, the stage was set. The empire of Southern Qi was crumbling, and the emperor himself, once cloaked in silk and reverence, would soon be stripped of both. In the year 501 CE, rebellion broke out, led by a general who had once sworn loyalty to the throne. The palace walls that had once protected Xiao Baowen would betray him. His soldiers would abandon him, and his enemies would decide his fate. That fate was not a sword across the neck. It was not exile, nor poison slipped into a goblet of wine. His fate was Lingchi, a punishment designed not to kill, but to unmake a man, to erase him piece by piece, flesh by flesh, until nothing remained but a lesson carved into memory. This was no ordinary execution. This was a nightmare come alive, and it would be remembered as the death of an emperor who ruled through terror, and who was repaid with terror 100-fold. The throne of an emperor is as much a prison as it is a seat of power for Zhao Baowan. It was a gilded cage lined with whispers, daggers, and shadows that never seemed to rest. He inherited the Southern Qi throne as a teenager, and with it, the crushing paranoia of a dynasty already teetering on collapse. To survive, he believed, he could not merely rule, he had to dominate. Paranoia was his constant companion. It stalked him in the stillness of the night and the ceremony of the court. Ministers approached his presence halls with dread, knowing the emperor's eyes were sharp, suspicious, and quick to condemn. Every smile seemed false, every bowed head a possible disguise for treachery. He ruled less as a statesman and more as a suspicious executioner, striking down anyone who might challenge his fragile authority. This paranoia bled into cruelty. Baowan became infamous for executing officials on the flimsiest of suspicions. A single rumor could mean a death sentence. Generals who had served the dynasty with loyalty found themselves accused of treason and dragged to their deaths. Court attendants, eunuchs, even members of his own family were not spared. The palace grounds became stained with the blood of those who once called him master. There are accounts of ministers summoned for routine discussions, only to leave the audience chamber in shackles, condemned before they had uttered a word in their defense. These executions were not private matters carried out discreetly behind palace walls. They were spectacles deliberately staged to instill fear. Bodies were displayed in public squares, reminders that the emperor's reach was absolute. But fear, while intoxicating, is a dangerous drug for rulers. It demands more and more to maintain its potency. Zhao Baowan fed his paranoia with blood, but it never quenched the gnawing hunger inside him. Instead, it poisoned the very roots of his reign. Those closest to him ceased to offer counsel. Instead, they flattered, lied, and conspired in silence, waiting for the moment when terror would no longer hold them in place, even as his cruelty tightened its grip. Zhao Baowan indulged in the luxuries of the palace. Chronicles describe a ruler obsessed with pleasure and detached from the suffering of his people. Silk-draped halls, lavish feasts, and indulgent concubines surrounded him, even as his empire fractured at the edges. To the subjects who toiled, under heavy taxes and constant wars, their emperor seemed not a leader, but a tyrant cocooned in decadence. This disconnect between ruler and ruled was a dangerous fault line. His reign was not built on the loyalty of generals or the trust of ministers. It was built on a fragile scaffolding of terror. Each execution bought him a few more days of safety, but each also created a new circle of enemies, grieving families, embittered generals, silent but watchful nobles. The ripple effect of his paranoia was devastating. Generals on the frontiers, once sworn to defend the dynasty, began to question why they should shed blood for a ruler who executed his own. Officials in the provinces whispered rebellion, their loyalty corroded by fear. Within the palace itself, even the servants moved like ghosts, aware that the emperor's moods could turn lethal at any moment. Yet for Baowan, this was the only way he knew how to rule. He was not the product of wisdom or counsel, but of blood and suspicion. To him, mercy was weakness, and hesitation was death. The Southern Qi Empire was fragile, and he convinced himself that only through fear could it be held together. But history teaches us this lesson again and again. Cruelty does not build loyalty, it erodes it. The very terror Baowan wielded his shield became the blade that cut away his support, piece by piece. By the time rebellion rose against him, there were few willing to defend his throne. Those who might have stood at his side had already been executed, exiled, or had long since abandoned him in silence. The emperor, who believed himself untouchable, was in truth a man standing alone in a crumbling palace of fear, and his paranoia, once his greatest weapon, would soon invite the storm that ended his reign in the most horrific fashion imaginable. Because, as history reminds us, power built on terror always consumes itself. The year was 501 CE, and rebellion thundered across the Southern Qi Empire. The architect of that revolt was General Xiaoyan, a man who had once served the dynasty loyally, but who now rose against the emperor whose cruelty had alienated both court and army. The rebellion spread like wild. Lingchi, death by 1,000 cuts. It was not execution in the usual sense. It was a ritual of annihilation, designed to strip away not only flesh but also dignity, to erase a man piece by piece. It was a sentence reserved for traitors and monsters, and now it would be inflicted upon the ruler who had once commanded millions. The scene of his execution was set in the heart of the capital. Crowds pressed in from all sides, drawn by the promise of spectacle. Some came to curse him, others to gawk in morbid fascination, and a few, perhaps those who had once served him, came in uneasy silence, unable to look away. On the first day, the executioners began with shallow cuts, thin slices across the arms, legs, and chest. The goal was not death, but pain. The emperor screamed, his body convulsing as blood trickled down his limbs. But the crowd was told this was only the beginning. On the second and third days, the cuts grew deeper. Strips of flesh were carved away, exposing raw muscle beneath. His skin, once cloaked in silk and gold, now hung in bloody ribbons. Baowan's voice grew hoarse from screaming, yet his executioners showed no mercy. Each incision was deliberate, each wound a reminder of the lives he had destroyed during his reign. By the fourth and fifth days, the spectacle turned even more grotesque. His ears were sliced away, then his nose, leaving his face a mask of ruin. Eyes wide with agony, he could no longer hold himself upright, his body sagging against restraints, trembling under the weight of endless torment. For the people who once cowered under his decrees, there was a grim satisfaction in seeing their tyrant reduced to this state. On the sixth day, the torment deepened further. His executioners cut into his torso, exposing ribs, slicing open his belly until entrails glistened. In the daylight, still, he clung to life, breath rattling, eyes glazed but conscious. It was as though death itself refused him, prolonging the cruelty to its fullest measure. Finally, on the seventh day, the ordeal came to an end. The final cuts were made, severing what remained of his ruined body. His voice, once the command of an emperor, fell silent forever. Where there had once been a throne, a dynasty, and the aura of divine authority, there was now only a mutilated corpse, a symbol of the terror he had spread, now turned back upon him. The crowd's reaction was divided. Some jeered, shouting curses, relishing the justice of heaven fulfilled. Others turned away in horror, unable to stomach the sight. And among the silent faces, perhaps, were those who wondered whether such cruelty was justice at all, or whether it was merely vengeance dressed in ritual. In that moment, the Southern Qi dynasty effectively ended. The emperor's blood seeped into the earth, and with it, the mandate of heaven that had once legitimized his reign. The man who had ruled through fear was destroyed by fear's ultimate expression, an execution so prolonged, so merciless, that it would be remembered not only as the death of an emperor, but as a nightmare that lived on in the chronicles of history. The death of an emperor is never just the death of a man. It is the collapse of a system, the rupture of alliances, and the unveiling of secrets whispered in the shadows. Xiaobei. Execution by Lingchi was not only an act of vengeance, it was the final act of a political drama years in the making. Inside the palace of Zhuankang, the emperor's court had long been divided. The southern Qi dynasty, though draped in the silks of legitimacy, was rotting beneath the surface. The ministers who attended court sessions often did so with trembling hands, knowing that a wrong word or even an unfortunate rumor could condemn them. Baowan's rule had transformed the palace into a haunted stage, a theater of fear where actors recited loyalty while plotting rebellion behind the curtain. For many years, discontent festered in whispers. The ministers who would watch colleagues executed without trial, the generals stripped of honors, the nobles who saw their families disgraced, all held their tongues, but none forgot. A court held together by terror is a court made of cracked glass, ready to shatter with the slightest pressure. That pressure came in the form of General Xiaoyan. Xiaoyan was no mere soldier. He was a calculating strategist, patient and cautious, the kind of man who knew that in politics, timing is everything. He had watched Baowan's excesses with cold eyes, gathering support quietly as the emperor's cruelty turned allies into enemies. Each execution that Baowan ordered only strengthened Xiaoyan's cause. Where the emperor ruled with fear, Xiaoyan offered the promise of stability. Where Baowan saw treason, Xiaoyan saw opportunity. By the turn of 501 CE, the conspiracy had swollen beyond whispers. Generals pledged secret allegiance, provinces quietly shifted their loyalties, and even members of Baowan's extended family began to hedge their bets. They knew the dynasty could not survive much longer under the emperor's paranoia. To preserve themselves, they would sacrifice him. When rebellion finally broke out, it was not a sudden explosion but a carefully orchestrated coup. Armies defected almost seamlessly, the palace walls surrounded before Baowan had time to rally defenders. His ministers, who once knelt at his feet, now stood idle. No one rushed to his aid. The emperor, who believed himself feared above all, discovered, too late, that fear does not guarantee loyalty. But the conspiracies did not end with his capture. The decision to condemn him to Lingchi rather than grant him a merciful death was itself a calculated move. Xiaoyan and his allies knew that Baowan's death could not be quiet. It had to be a performance. The people who had suffered under his rule needed to see him stripped of power, dignity, and life in the most complete way possible. Only then could Xiaoyan seize legitimacy as the avenger of the people. And so the court framed the execution not as barbarity, but as justice. Ministers proclaimed that heaven had withdrawn its mandate from Baowan, that the tyrant must be punished like any common criminal. Buddhist monks muttered that karmic balance was being restored. Taoist seers declared that the blood of the emperor would cleanse the empire. In reality, it was nothing more than political theater, cruelty repackaged as cosmic order. Behind closed doors, however, the whispers were darker. Some nobles delighted in the spectacle, relishing the downfall of the man who had terrorized them. Others shivered, recognizing the dangerous precedent. If the Son of Heaven himself could be mutilated in public, then what protection did rank or title truly offer? The execution, while framed as justice, also revealed the fragility of power itself. The palace corridors, once filled with the echo of Beowulf's commands, now buzzed with gossip. Servants carried tales of his screams. Eunuchs recounted the sight of his ruined body. Every detail of his suffering spread through the capital like wildfire, exaggerated and reshaped with each retelling. In taverns, people toasted his demise. In monasteries, monks debated whether such cruelty stained the soul of the new regime. And in the private chambers of courtiers, some wondered whether heaven truly smiled upon such an act, or whether the empire had traded one kind of tyranny for another. Xiao Yan, of course, understood the importance of appearances. He did not wield the knife himself. He let the executioners do their work, while he stood apart, cultivating the image of a reluctant savior. To the people, he was the man who had ended Beowulf's reign of terror. To the court, he was the steady hand that would restore order. But, in truth, his power was built upon the same foundations of blood and fear, only cloaked in discipline and calculation rather than paranoia. The political intrigue surrounding Beowulf's death was as significant as the execution itself. The spectacle was not just the destruction of a man, but the destruction of a dynasty, carefully staged to legitimize its successor. The ministers who had once quaked under Beowulf's glare now bent their knees to Xiao Yan. The generals who had once sworn allegiance to the southern Qi now rallied to the banners of the Liang. But beneath the surface, the hypocrisy lingered. Those who condemned Beowulf most loudly had once cheered his decrees. Those who claimed heaven's will had only shifted their loyalties to survive. The court, as always, was a nest of snakes, and Beowulf, for all his cruelty, had merely been the serpent who lost his fangs. The execution was a scandal, a ritual, and a warning. It revealed not just the downfall of one emperor, but the truth of imperial power itself, that rulers are for the common people, the execution was catharsis. For years, they had lived under the shadow of a paranoid tyrant who taxed them mercilessly, executed their local leaders, and demanded loyalty enforced through fear. Now, standing in the crowded square, they saw that fear turned back upon its master. The man who had once demanded their obedience through terror was himself trembling, screaming, stripped of dignity. For the poor and powerless, it was as if the scales of heaven had finally balanced. Stories spread quickly through villages and markets. The emperor had been cut apart for 7 days, his voice breaking with agony, his flesh falling piece by piece. Whether the details were accurate mattered little. The legend of his death became a form of collective justice, a tale to be told by peasants who had little else to call victory. But among the nobility and scholars, the response was more complicated. On one hand, they too felt relief. Many of them had lost fathers, brothers, or allies to Beowulf's paranoia. His downfall was proof that tyranny could not last forever. Yet the spectacle of Lingchi inflicted upon an emperor disturbed them deeply. Traditionally, the Son of Heaven was more than a ruler. He was the axis between earth and sky, the embodiment of the cosmic order. To see that sacred role reduced to a mutilated corpse was to see the mandate of heaven itself desecrated. Some nobles whispered uneasily, if even an emperor could be humiliated and butchered like a criminal, what security did their own titles truly offer? The execution, while meant as a warning against tyranny, also reminded the elite of their own fragility. Religious voices added yet another layer of interpretation. Buddhist monks framed Beowulf's death as karmic retribution, the inevitable fruit of cruelty ripening at last. They preached that his agony was the repayment for every unjust death he had ordered, every life he had destroyed. Taoist seers, too, found meaning in the blood-soaked spectacle, declaring that heaven had withdrawn its favor and that the empire was being cleansed through the emperor's suffering. In this way, the execution was transformed into something more than punishment. It was seen as a cosmic ritual, a sacrifice demanded by the heavens themselves to restore balance. Yet not all saw it as justice. Some quiet voices, especially among Confucian scholars, questioned whether the act itself was not a corruption of moral order. Confucian tradition emphasized the ruler as the father of the people, a figure to be respected even in failure. To mutilate an emperor, to cut him apart in front of the masses, was in their eyes a grotesque violation of decorum. Yes, Beowulf had been a tyrant. Yes, he had brought ruin upon himself. But should justice itself descend into barbarity? These uneasy reflections circulated in private writings, though few dared speak them too loudly. The cultural impact of Lingchi extended beyond Beowulf himself. For centuries afterward, his fate became a cautionary tale. Parents warned disobedient children, even the Son of Heaven can be cut to pieces. Officials whispered to one another when a ruler grew cruel, remember Baojuan. His execution had seared itself into collective memory, not only as an act of punishment, but as a lesson in the limits of power. And yet, as with many spectacles of cruelty, it also carried a darker legacy: the normalization of Lingchi for emperors and high officials set a precedent. If even the ruler could be subjected to such torment, then surely lesser men could too. Over time, the punishment was inflicted on rebels, traitors, and criminals, sometimes lasting hours, sometimes days. The spectacle of mutilation became woven into the culture of fear that emperors themselves would later use to enforce order, a bitter irony. Considering Beowulf's own downfall, in the end, the execution was not just an end but a transformation. To the peasants, it was justice. To the nobles, it was a warning. To the monks, it was karma. To the chroniclers, it was a story too powerful to forget. Zhao Beowan had ruled through fear and in death. He became the ultimate example of fear turned upon itself. The cultural shockwaves of his dismemberment rippled far beyond his reign. They forced society to reckon with questions that have never fully faded. What is justice? What is vengeance? And when rulers fall, do we punish the man? Or do we punish the very idea of power he embodied? Every reign has a breaking point. For Zhao Beowan, it was not a sudden strike of fate, but a slow, grinding collapse. A dynasty eaten away from within until its very foundations gave way. By the year 501 CE, the empire of Southern Qi was a house already burning. All it needed was a final spark. That spark came from General Xiaoyan, whose rebellion ignited in the provinces and spread with terrifying speed. To many, he was not merely a usurper, but a deliverer. His armies marched under the banner of justice, carrying the promise of liberation from Beowulf's cruelty. Cities that had once sworn loyalty to the throne opened their gates to him. Garrisons switched sides without a fight. It was not conquest, it was defection on a scale that left the emperor isolated, his realm shrinking by the day. Within the capital of Jiankong, the emperor's court became a theater of panic. Reports of advancing armies arrived daily, each one worse than the last. Beowulf reacted not with strategy but with rage. He shouted, issued frantic decrees, and demanded impossible feats of loyalty from generals who no longer obeyed. Some ministers attempted to calm him, to suggest compromise, or negotiation. They were executed on the spot. His paranoia was now fully unchained, consuming what little stability remained. The Emperor's psychological unraveling was visible to all who remained near him. Sleepless nights turned his eyes hollow. He wandered the palace halls, muttering to himself, convinced of conspiracies in every shadow. His meals went untouched for fear of poison. Guards standing post at night heard him pacing and whispering. A man once enthroned as the Son of Heaven, now reduced to a prisoner of his own mind. As the rebels drew closer, the palace began to empty. Servants slipped away in the night, eunuchs vanished, and even members of his own family abandoned him. The vast halls that had once echoed with the bustle of a royal household fell eerily silent. Only a handful of terrified attendants remained, not out of loyalty, but because they had nowhere else to go. At last, the rebellion broke through the outer defenses of Zhongkang. The capital shook with the thunder of drums, the clash of steel, the roar of soldiers chanting Xiaoyan's name. From the palace walls, Baowan could see smoke rising, hear the screams of those cut down in the streets. Yet even in this final hour, he clung to the illusion of power. He dressed himself in imperial robes, as though silk could protect him from steel. He issued decrees to armies that no longer existed. He called upon ministers who had fled or been executed. It was then that the final betrayal came. His own guards, seeing the futility of resistance, turned on him. Some opened the gates, allowing rebels to flood into the palace. Others seized the Emperor himself, dragging him from his chambers. The Son of Heaven, who had once commanded life and death with a gesture, now found himself bound and trembling before the very soldiers he had trusted. For Zhao Yan and his allies, the capture of the Emperor was not enough. To execute him with a simple sword stroke would not satisfy the fury of the people. They needed a punishment that would strip him not only of life, but of the aura of divinity that surrounded his throne. His downfall had to be a spectacle, a warning to any who might think themselves above heaven's justice. And so the sentence was passed. Lingchi. At that moment, the turning point became irreversible. The dynasty of Southern Qi was finished. The Emperor's cries of defiance turned to pleas, then to silence. The courtiers, who once bowed at his feet, now stood in the crowd, watching as he was dragged away to his fate. The rebellion was no longer just a political victory. It had become a moral reckoning, written not in proclamations, but in blood. And yet, for all its brutality, the execution was not merely an act of justice. It was also the sealing of Zhao Yan's power. By staging Baowan's torment as a public ritual, he ensured that no one would question the legitimacy of his takeover. He became not a usurper, but a redeemer, the man who avenged a nation. But if Zhao Yun had hoped the execution would erase Baowan's memory, he was mistaken. Far from fading into obscurity, Baowan's grotesque death ensured his reign would never be forgotten. Historians of later dynasties seized upon the tale, painting him as the archetype of a tyrant undone by his own cruelty. His paranoia, his killings, his decadence, all were retold as moral lessons, culminating in the unforgettable image of his body cut apart over 7 long days. In this way, Baowan's death became more than a punishment. It became a cautionary tale. For rulers, it was a chilling reminder that the mandate of heaven could be withdrawn in the most humiliating fashion. To rule through fear alone was to risk becoming the very object of terror oneself. Future emperors studied his fate as a warning. Cruelty could protect a throne for a time, but it could never secure it forever. The practice of Lingchi itself gained new symbolic weight. Though it had been used before, Beowulf's execution set a precedent. If even the emperor could be subjected to such torment, then no man was untouchable. The punishment became infamous as the ultimate sentence for traitors and criminals, whispered of with dread. Over the centuries, it would be inflicted again and again, a legacy of horror that lingered until its abolition in the early 20th century. But in the chronicles of Chinese history, Beowulf remained its most infamous imperial victim. The psychological legacy was equally powerful. Chroniclers described the emperor's torment in graphic detail, ensuring that readers could not escape the horror. His suffering became a mirror for the cruelty he had inflicted on others. For peasants, the story was justice delivered by heaven itself. For officials, it was a lesson in caution, proof that no title or rank could shield them if they lost the trust of the people and the loyalty of their armies. For later rulers, it was a silent specter at the edge of every decision: rule wisely or risk becoming another Beowulf. And yet, the story also reveals the hypocrisy of power. The same ministers who had once flattered Beowulf now condemned him as a monster. The same nobles who had trembled before his orders now declared that his suffering was heaven's justice. The court, in truth, had not changed, only the man at the top had been replaced. History may record Beowulf as a tyrant, but his execution also exposed the opportunism and treachery that surrounded him. In that sense, his death was not only the punishment of one man, but the unveiling of an entire system built on fear and betrayal. Archaeological evidence is scarce, but the written records endure. Chroniclers in later dynasties sharpened their pens with moral intent, ensuring that Beowulf's story was not just history but allegory. He became a symbol of the dangers of paranoia, cruelty, and indulgence. His legacy was not a